Hi, my name is Ed Keable. I'm the Superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park. Thank you for the opportunity for me to speak to you today. I'm sorry I'm not there live, but I'm actually not I'm only kind of sorry that I'm not there live because actually while you're watching this, I'm skiing in Austria. So I will be thinking of you on that day. I'm about to have my second anniversary next month as superintendent. Uh, and in that time I've been here in the park, I have had a tremendous experience and have been really impressed with the passion of so many people who care about the Grand Canyon National Park, including you. I was on the river twice last year, once in March and once in August. My March trip was a Zuni archaeological trip with Grand Canyon Whitewater. My August trip was a GCC donor trip with ASRA. And both those trips taught me a lot about the river and about the guides who take our river visitors on those trips. In my March trip, we started in a blizzard and then rode the river in a driving rainstorm. Along the way, we also had an opportunity to camp twice at Upper Tanner, and for about 40 straight hours, we had 40-mile-an-hour winds that were driving sand everywhere, including inside my tent when I was sleeping. I would wake up in the middle of the night with sand covering my face, even though all my flaps were closed. The August trip had sweltering heat of in the neighborhood of 120 degrees and really tremendous squalls at the end of the day, particularly as we tried to set up camp. One night when we were setting up camp at Keable Beach, the driving rain and wind were so strong that even though my husband and I were both in the tent, my husband laying on a cot, and after we had put all of our gear and some heavy stones in the tent, and I was standing in the tent holding the crossbars, the wind still knocked us over. And part of what I took from those trips was that in order to really enjoy the experience at the canyon, on the river, you have to embrace adversity. And the spirit of everybody on those trips, particularly the guides, really embraced that idea, and it made those trips really fantastic opportunities to really learn the river and really learn about the canyon. So I want to thank those guides in particular who joined me on those trips, but also all of you for the passion you bring to the park. I want to spend some time talking about my priorities as superintendent and where we are with some of them for your awareness. And I'll start with talking about Indigenous affairs. This is an area in which the park is leading in the National Park Service and really the federal government in a number of areas. We started working really in earnest with the establishment of the Intertribal Working Group in 2013, which is helping us to develop a plan for how we can reimagine the work we do at Desert View. This is a really important project, in part because the history of the Grand Canyon is just filled with tragedy as it relates to our indigenous neighbors. The park was established in a way that forcibly removed the indigenous people from the lands which they called home from time immemorial. And then the Park Service has kept those people out of their lands for a century as we've managed the park. The work at Desert View that started in 2013 is changing that narrative. It's taken us several years to build trust with our indigenous neighbors, but we are at a point now when we are working very closely and collaboratively with indigenous people to reimagine how the Grand Canyon operates and can operate going into the future. The theme of the work we're doing that is established by the Intertribal Working Group is that we are still here, and by that means that indigenous people are still here.
We are the breath of this land and national parks. Listen,
and you will hear our ancestors at these sacred places.
we are indigenous to these lands, the original caretakers.
The stories that tie this nation together. We are our ancestors, the hope of the future. We will not be forgotten.
A lot of the visitors to the Grand Canyon have no idea about the cultural history of this place. Historically the Park Service has tried to provide that interpretation from mostly a perspective of people who look like me, white men, white women, and we are now actively working with our tribal neighbors to bring indigenous people, both in the green and the gray uniforms and tribal members, into the park to provide interpretive opportunities. The work at Desert View has been in the plan phase for 8 years now, and in December we broke ground on redesigning the amphitheater where we'll provide outdoor interpretive opportunities at Desert View near the Watchtower. Later this year we'll begin work on construction of other aspects of the redesign of the Desert View Watchtower area, including developing a tribal welcome center from which tribal people will be able to talk to Grand Canyon visitors and educate them about opportunities to extend their tourism on tribal lands near the Grand Canyon.
Our history of the Havasupai people, this is their Aboriginal homeland. This is where our first beginning, our people were. A lot of this land base right here has our ancestors' footsteps, our ancestors being here, living off the land. This whole canyon as a whole is a very sacred place in our eyes, and we still, the Havasupai exist, and we still watch over it as much as we can.
Songs not only give direction, songs not only remember the past, but they remind us of where we're going, of our future, of the Zuni people's future, of how we need to carry on with what our ancestors have taught us. With that, our culture and our history will live on forever.
For the National Park Service here at Grand Canyon, it's important to have the Park Service's voice be in the background, and for the people whose histories are here to be the ones telling it. Here at Desert View, we're going to have the first person, the indigenous people, the communities, the people whose ancestors lived here, who are still here, tell their histories rather than the Park Service retell and retell and retell. It's that first voice, it's that original voice. That's what we want to be able to do.
The Grand Canyon Watchtower was opened in 1932, so it was during the time building up to that, I assume about a year before, that my grandfather was working on the murals here in this particular room. I feel like the National Park's recent initiatives to highlight Desert View as a cultural center where people can experience the authenticity of Native cultures, I feel like that's very important. I also feel like those voices should permeate all throughout the canyon, you know, because this is our home. This is the home of our mothers, the home of our fathers.
Desert View is one of the most visited areas of Grand Canyon National Park, and we want to transform this place from just the watchtower, which is a beautiful structure that was built by Mary Coulter with influence from tribal members throughout the area and her research that she did of tribal lands around the Southwest, into a place where visitors can interact with tribal members themselves, learn their stories, see their cultural demonstrations, and hopefully go and visit those tribal lands. In 2013, the National Park Service formed the Intertribal Working Group. It's made up of Park Service staff, tribal members, and as a nonprofit partner of the park, Grand Canyon Conservancy. The important part for non-tribal members was listening, hearing what tribal members not only wanted, but what they needed to create an authentic experience for visitors. So they would tell us what they wanted to see. The park would go back, develop plans, come back to the tribes, get input, go back and revise, and come back again. So it's been a very collaborative project. There's been input from both sides. And because of that, this will be a long-term project. This won't be here for the next 5 to 10 years. This intertribal heritage site will be here for generations to come.
What we're looking at is a sustainable idea where we're using the existing infrastructure, upgrading where we can, adding new outdoor spaces that don't require a lot. It may well be outdoor ramadas where we can have, in the summertime, shade created and storytelling going on or demonstrations going on, and allow the various tribal groups who have decided they want to participate to have the spaces that they want and not be so structured into a square building. Our vision for this is really and truly to make this a living space and just not a building that will fall into disrepair.
Because the park has been consulting, I think the management also has opened up this talk, this dialogue with the tribes, which has really been beneficial to the tribes and the communities to say, hey, we want to come back into the park. The tribes were able to speak for themselves and voice some of the concerns that they had and things that they want to see. I support the project because it allows us an opportunity for my community specifically to go back into the park, to maybe tell their stories firsthand from a tribal perspective, and just work with the other tribes in telling our stories at Desert View.
To fulfill the vision of this project will require significant investment in the grounds and structures at Desert View. With your generous support, we'll be able to transform the Desert View Intertribal Heritage Site into a place where visitors from around the world can interact with Grand Canyon's First People.
The interesting aspect about this is that we're not only welcoming tribal people in to provide interpretive programming opportunities or economic opportunities through vending, we're also starting to talk earnestly with our tribal neighbors about co-managing the park. So, for example, one of the things that we're doing is we're looking at turning over the operations of the Tusayan Archaeological Site and Museum. Tusayan is a 800-year-old ancestral Puebloan site. The Park Service traditionally has provided interpretive programming there as well as managing a museum space there. We're in negotiations with a tribal entity to take over those opportunities. We'll likely start this year by providing vending opportunities for indigenous artists at Tusayan while the park continues to manage that site. This year, because COVID has limited our ability to work with our tribal neighbors to really advance this initiative on a faster pace. But this is a sort of a down payment on how we hope to work with our tribal neighbors in managing the park, is actually give them opportunities to manage parts of the park. Another opportunity that may come in the near future is what we are now already starting to call Havasupai Gardens in the park. In the 1930s, the National Park Service forcibly evicted Havasupai tribal members from what is now called Indian Garden. The park has been working with the Havasupai Tribal Council for some time now to rename Indian Garden. The Tribal Council last year passed a resolution requesting the park to rename Indian Garden to be Havasupai Gardens. So the park, working with the tribe, submitted a formal request to the Board of Geographic Names to make that name change happen. We're still waiting for the board to approve that request. We think they will do that, but they've got a tremendous backlog that they're working through, particularly as they work through offensive cultural names. So we're in the queue to have that name change. In the meantime, we're working with the Havasupai tribal members with blessings of the council to begin to reinterpret Havasupai Gardens. That work has already started. Raider Lane has developed some Minute Out In It films with Havasupai tribal members.
For the Havasupai, we've been in this area since time immemorial. You know, we have schools, a medical facility, we have a government, we're working on broadband, we're raising families down there, we're growing corn, Supai sunflowers, we're going swimming in the water, we're doing what we can to protect the land. The most important thing about this project is to get that information out to the public, for them to recognize that the Havasupai, this is our land. No past tense allowed. Don't say it was our land. That's an inappropriate statement. It is our land. And I think that people will come to find that the Park Service is willing to recognize that now, and that we are trying our best to work together, because we can't take any steps back. And we also can't change what's already been done. The important thing is how can we change it now and move forward?
Pamhakika, Pamavsoka, Banyavme, Nibak Matakwaka, Mawam Sivka, Nibal Matavkichimka, Hav, Quachikyuka, Nibak Baka, Kudav, Kuchat, Nibal Kwewalachika, Havsu Pachuka, Nibak Matavsochka, Nibak Waka. Nibak swat chuba, kwau chuba, kwekanav chuba, nibak baka, nibak kwau kyuchika, mawam sivchika, pakyove, pam uka, pam apso, inyavka, situlke, kwevke, metavke, matanya chitichuba, nyakatal pilube. Nyava me pam hakaka, niba matanya chita chukwawoke, miakatal pila kwawoke, kwek mahayin kwawoka, kwek yapayin nyupa kwawoke.
The Grand Canyon is not just rock. It is the essence of spirit.
We're also working at changing our signage and working with tribal members to figure out how we should comprehensively provide interpretive programming at Havasupai Gardens that in a way that's respectful and honest for the history of that place, including the Park Service forcibly removing tribal members from their homes there. I've charged my facilities team to begin to look at some of those buildings as possible places for Havasupai tribal members to utilize, so that there's a constant presence of Havasupai tribal members at Havasupai Gardens, both so that they can provide continuous interpretive programs, but also to help us manage that facility. There are other opportunities we're looking at for co-management. One area in particular that I'm really excited about, but which is creating some challenges that we're working through, is the historic village. I had a conversation with Ed Kabodi, who is a Hopi tribal member, who expressed some concerns to me that Desert View would become something of its own type of reservation, where it would be a limited area within the park within which tribal members would have the opportunity to provide interpretive programming and maybe help us manage the park. And I assured Ed that my vision is to extend the Desert View vision to the rest of the park, to Tusayan Ruins, to Havasupai Gardens, to the historic village, to the North Rim, and even to the river corridor as we begin to work on developing a comprehensive curriculum that is, again, respectful and honest to the indigenous experience on the river. The historic village has buildings like the Powerhouse and the old Fred Harvey paint shop and the old mule barn that are either not utilized or they're significantly underutilized, and those buildings are deteriorating. So I'm working with the Park Service to establish funding to stabilize those buildings towards the goal of working with commercial ventures to convert those buildings into commercial spaces, restaurant space, hotel space, museum space, retail space. And I'm particularly interested in working with indigenous organizations to help us provide an opportunity at the historic village similar to Desert View, where we can incorporate indigenous programming and indigenous economic opportunities. A lot of really interesting developments that are going on. We're making progress across the board on implementing those initiatives, and look forward to continuing working on those issues in the ensuing years. Another priority for me is enhancing science. When I got to the park 2 years ago, the Science and Resource Management Division was significantly understaffed. A number of positions had not been filled for a number of years. I'm working through the National Park Service appropriations process to try to reestablish those positions. That process is a slow, cumbersome process, but we're making progress. I had gotten approval through the President's budget for the current fiscal year to add almost $250,000 for positions in SRM. That funding has been tied up in the budget difficulties for the current fiscal year, but I'm hopeful that we'll get those monies eventually, and we'll continue to try to enhance science funding in the park. I'm also working with the Grand Canyon Conservancy to find donor money for scientific programs and for positions in SRM. Another aspect of enhancing SRM is really trying to reestablish and grow a citizen science program. When I was in the river, the guides I spent time with demonstrated a significant amount of knowledge about the science of the canyon and a passion for it. And they also expressed interest of participating in providing information to SRM to make sure that we have as much real-time and ongoing information about what's going on in the canyon as we can. And I want to tap into your interest and your passion and your knowledge and provide mechanisms for you to provide that information to SRM. So our new SRM chief, Dave Worthington, will be speaking to you later, and will provide more detail on what we're doing and how we're doing it and what our vision is, and to get some feedback from you as we continue to do that. The third of 4 priorities, actually, is our deferred maintenance construction program. This park has $750 million worth of deferred maintenance that relates to everything from the Trans-Canyon Water Line to roads and trails and a whole host of things in between. We are working through the National Park Service appropriations process and through a process that the Washington office has established to tap into Great America Outdoors Act funds, which is a $7 billion fund that Congress passed last year for parks to address deferred maintenance across the system to address those deferred maintenance challenges. So here in this park, we expect over the next 2 to 7 years to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 million to totally replace our Trans-Canyon water line, the water that we get from the canyon to feed the South Rim, also the water line that goes to the North Rim, 4 wastewater systems, 1 on the North Rim, 1 at Phantom Ranch, and 2 on the South Rim, 1 in the Historic Village and 1 at Desert View. We're replacing the electrical grid. So we're doing a whole lot of work over the next several years to improve our systems, most of which were designed in the 1960s and implemented in the 1970s with a 25-year shelf life. And they were designed for a visitor population of 2 to 2.5 million. So we are 25 to 30 years past the shelf life of those systems. And pre-pandemic, we were getting 6.4 million visitors, not 2 to 2.5 million visitors. So those systems are breaking and need to be replaced. We will experience, particularly with the Trans-Canyon waterline, some opportunities to close trails on a limited basis while we do that work. But we're designing that work to minimize the impact on our visitors, both on the Bright Angel Trail and at Phantom Ranch. The fourth of the priorities I wanted to talk to you about is river operations. After several years of contracting river operations in the park, both our visitor resource protection patrols and our administrative river operations, we are this year getting back on the river. VRP has already started river operations, and the administrative river operations team is working on hiring small boat operators that'll get us back on the rivers. We'll continue to use contract operators until we are fully staffed, but I think it's a significant development for the park that we are getting back on the river. It's an important program, and we have implemented a series of reforms that address the challenges that we had on the river that were brought to light in the 2015 Office of Inspector General report on sexual harassments on the river. And so we spent the last several years really taking a hard look on those operations and identifying processes and procedures to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes as we get back in the river. So I look forward to increasing our work as we continue to work with you to make the river the tremendous experience that it is for you and for our visitors that you bring onto the river. So in closing, I want to thank you again for the work that you do, for the passion that you have for the Grand Canyon and the river, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the years to come. Thank you.